Hello everyone and happy Easter, and welcome to another special bonus surprise episode in the Trail Went Cold's feed today titled Deceptions and Resurrections. As you probably know, Shane Waters' The Foul Play podcast has organized a number of these joint collaborative episodes involving several true crime podcasts, including yours truly, where each host will take turns spending about 10 minutes or less talking about a case which fits the episode's theme. I've previously participated in special Halloween and Valentine's Day themed episodes, and now I'm going to make an appearance in this special Easter themed episode involving stories about people who fake their own deaths. You'll find a list of all the participating podcasts in the show notes, and about 41 minutes in, you'll hear me discuss a bizarre story from Uganda about an innocent man who was sent to death row for murdering someone who turned out to be alive the whole time. So without any further ado, I hope you all enjoy Deceptions and Resurrections.
Hello, friend. Have a seat. Welcome to another fascinating collaboration podcast I've arranged. I'm Shane Waters, the host of Foul Play Crime Series, and today we're about to embark on a wondrous journey, an Easter adventure unlike any other. During our time together, 12 podcaster friends of mine will be joining us to share true stories of fake deaths. All podcasts are listed in the show notes, along with a link on where to find them. As we prepare for the excitement that lies ahead, let's take a moment to reflect on the origins of this cherished holiday. The history of Easter is a fascinating blend of religious, cultural, and pagan traditions. At its core, Easter is a Christian holiday, celebrating the resurrection of their central religious figure from the dead, an event that holds great significance for Christians worldwide. However, the origins of Easter can be traced back to even earlier traditions, with some elements of the holiday borrowed from ancient pagan customs. The name Easter is believed to have originated from the Old English word Istra, or Ustra, which is connected to the name of a pagan goddess, Istra. Istra was a goddess of spring and fertility in Anglo-Saxon and Germanic mythology, celebrated during the spring equinox. The connection to the spring equinox, with spring being a time of renewal and rebirth, likely influenced the adoption of Easter as the name for the Christian holiday that celebrates the resurrection of Jesus. Now that we've set the stage, let's dive into our adventure. Walking through the sun-dappled forest, a flash of movement catches our eye. A rabbit. But this isn't just any ordinary rabbit. It's wearing a waistcoat and carrying a pocket watch. Curiosity piqued, we follow the rabbit down a hole, tumbling into a world of wonder and whimsy. As we dust ourselves off, we meet our first peculiar character, a wise old owl named Ophelia, perched on a tree branch.
Hello, dear traveler. Welcome to the Enchanted Easterlands. I see you met our rabbit friend. I encourage you to continue on this mysterious path.
At the base of the tree is our first storyteller of the night, Charlie from Crime Lines.
It started on March 15th, 1957, when 30-year-old Lawrence Bader kissed his wife Mary Lou goodbye and left their Akron, Ohio home for a business trip to Cleveland. Larry wrapped up his business around 4 p.m. and set out to Lake Erie to sneak in a little fishing time before he headed home. At 4:30, Larry shoved off in a rented boat. That evening, a storm hit the area and Larry Bader disappeared. When the boat was found abandoned the next day, all of the life jackets were accounted for. Without a life jacket, there was no way Larry could survive long on the cold waters of Lake Erie. A search of the lake and the surrounding area gave no clues, and Larry Bader was, quote, presumed dead, leaving behind 3 young children and a pregnant wife. 3 years after Larry disappeared, Mary Lou had him declared officially dead, and the family continued their lives in Akron, missing Larry but moving forward. In 1965, 5 years after Larry was declared dead and 8 years after he was last seen, a friend of his traveled to Chicago for a sporting goods convention. And there he saw a man who was the spitting image of Larry Bader. Almost the spitting image. This man had an eye patch, having lost an eye to cancer a couple of years before. And he had a mustache. But other than that, this was Larry Bader alive and well. At least the friend thought so. This friend quickly called Larry's family, who showed up in Chicago and were also convinced that this man was Larry. But he said he wasn't. He was Fritz Johnson of Omaha, Nebraska. The family did talk Fritz into going to the police station to be fingerprinted. Since Larry had been in the Navy, his prints were on record. Fritz agreed, seeing this as the fastest way to clear this whole thing up. The fingerprint card was sent off to the FBI to compare to the Navy records, and the prints matched. Fritz Johnson was, in fact, Lawrence Bader. Even after this, Fritz still denied his identity. He wasn't a Larry, and he wasn't from Akron. He had arrived in Omaha 5 years before, 4 days after Larry had disappeared, but Fritz said that was just a coincidence. He had grown up in Boston, having been raised in an orphanage there. After arriving in Omaha, Fritz had quickly gained popularity thanks to his flamboyant personality. He bought an old hearse and had the back converted into a mobile lounge. He hosted champagne parties in his home and dated the most eligible young women in town. After getting his dream job at a radio station, Fritz threw himself into the promotional side of being a public personality. He dressed in colonial garb for a Washington Day event. He sat on top of a 50-foot flagpole for 15 days to raise money for charity. He had his friends hoist up 2 martinis a day to keep him sustained. Soon, Fritz was noticed by television station KETV, and he was hired on as the sports director, and later married the local model Nancy Zimmer. Fritz Johnson certainly wasn't playing the part of a man who was trying to hide, going on TV and rallying up publicity for himself. But after his true identity was revealed, Fritz went back to Omaha and hired a lawyer. He was in a pickle. He was both currently dead and a bigamist, 2 situations that put him in precarious legal standing. The lawyer recommended a full workup at the hospital. Fritz went inpatient for 10 days, and the doctors could come to no conclusions. Through multiple interviews, they could not rattle Fritz's story. He showed no memory of his life as Larry Bader, yet remembered many details from Fritz's origin story without issue. But the doctors also could not find any physical reason why Fritz would have suffered from amnesia. Even if he was injured in the boat incident, it didn't explain having a whole new life backstory 4 days later when he showed up in Omaha. Some believed Larry was lying, having fled his considerable debts and the confines of his respectable life in Akron. His second wife, Nancy, may have been among the doubters because she soon sought an annulment. Fritz then lost his job at the TV station due to the bad press and had to go work as a bartender. After he paid child support to both of his wives, he had around $30 left each week and could only afford to live in a YMCA men's shelter. And then 7 months after being legally restored to life, Lawrence Joseph Bader and/or Fritz Johnson died of cancer on September 16, 1966, at the age of 39. A memorial service was held for Fritz in Omaha, after which his body was sent to Akron to be buried as Lawrence Joseph Bader in the family plot. The question of if this was a hoax or a true instance of a rare form of amnesia has never fully been answered. Some have offered a middle-of-the-road theory, marrying the two options. It was first suggested by Fritz's attorney, whose job was to keep him from getting charged criminally or civilly. In this version of events, Larry decided to ditch the family in Akron and to live unencumbered in the wild metropolis of Omaha. But after he had that first surgery that removed his eye due to his cancer, something went wrong and his memory was affected. This surgery essentially erased his memories of being Larry Bader, but left Fritz Johnson intact. And Fritz began to believe his own lies.
The rabbit leads us to a field of flowers, swaying in the wind. As we meander through the field, the vibrant colors of the flowers create a mesmerizing tapestry, and the sweet fragrance of blossoms fills the air. Blossom, dancing flower with a stunning smile, twirls gracefully, her petals a brilliant shade of pink, the embodiment of joy and renewal.
Hello, traveler. Don't be shy. Join me in my dance. Together, we celebrate the rebirth of life in the Enchanted Easterlands.
We dance with Blossom, our spirits lifted by the sight and scent of the blooming flowers. Joining us now in the field of flowers is Josh, from Rotten to the Core.
Hello and happy Easter, everyone. It's time to celebrate the resurrection of nature from the death of winter. It is also officially springtime and time to shake off those winter blues. I asked my magic mirror to show me a fake death from history, but make it funny, and it did not disappoint. I bring to you the tale of a man who was born a poor fool, grew to be a rich fool, and died an old fool. His name was Timothy Dexter, and he faked his death not for money, safety, or any of the usual reasonings. He did it solely for the attention and to make sure his wife would be sad enough. Now, most men will only receive flowers at their funeral. Timothy didn't want to wait, but this was long before Miley told us that we could buy them ourselves. Timothy was born to poor colonial farmers in 1748 in what is now Massachusetts. He only had a few years of schooling before dropping out at the age of 8. After several years working on his parents' farm, he left for Boston to apprentice for a tanner. He is known as a lucky fool, and when he was 21, Timothy met an older widow who happened to be loaded. He was soon living with her on her lavish estate in Boston. While he could have just enjoyed the lifestyle of having a sugar mama, Timothy wanted to make a name for himself as well as his own fortune. So, being the somewhat pushy guy that he was, he began to seek business advice from his neighbors, like John Hancock. His problem would be that his neighbors absolutely despised him. New money. How droll. Not only was he from out of their social circles, but he was uneducated and eccentric beyond all get out. In an attempt to bankrupt him and rid themselves of his presence, they gave him a lot of bad advice, and he didn't hesitate to listen to every word. He had no knowledge of their business dealings and foolishly trusted them. Again, his luck would show its hand because out of all the bad advice they gave him, it miraculously kept working out in his favor. One thing they convinced him to do was to send a shipment of bed warming pans to the Caribbean, sheet warmers to a tropical climate. Well, he listened and lucked out. There was a desperate need for ladles and pots for the booming sugarcane business on the islands. It gets worse, or better, I should say. They also convinced him to trap and ship all the stray cats he could and send them as well. Just imagine a cargo ship full of nothing but stray cats. He again listened, and long and behold, guess who was in desperate need of a solution to their rat infestation? You guessed it, the Caribbean. He sold out of cats and the pans, all at a high price. Timothy made the largest portion of his wealth after the end of the American Revolution. His neighbors had convinced him to buy the newly printed continental currency, which was a new form of money used to help fund the war. They weren't backed by any kind of asset like precious metals. They ended up losing value quickly, and that is right when Timothy poured all of his and his wife's money into buying them for a portion of a penny each. And yet again, as luck would have it, everything worked out in his favor. At the end of the war, Congress had agreed to buy them back at 1 penny on the dollar. It was bad for everyone except Timothy. He had so many, in fact, that it actually ended up making him a millionaire. Why isn't his life a movie yet? It sounds like a high school drama where the rich girls are mean to the not-so-smart new girl. All her ideas backfire, and then it's revealed that the new girl was actually a genius the whole time. The whole time. His neighbors were livid, and his increase in wealth only fueled his eccentricity. He went and bought a mansion and decorated the yard with huge stone bases topped with 40 life-size wooden statues. Next to his own was one of Thomas Jefferson that had the Constitution of Independence engraved on it. Aw, bless his heart. By this time, the American Revolution was over, and it caused an end to people having titles such as Lord and Ladies. He still declared that he should be considered as a lord from now on and began going by Lord Dexter. Eventually, Lord Dexter, as I said, grew to be an old fool. And out of what I can only imagine as boredom, he decided to fake his own death to see how many people would show up and how hard they would mourn him. He had a mausoleum built for it and told his family to play along. Over 30,000 people showed up to the funeral, but during, he noticed that his wife wasn't crying hard enough. She was even seen laughing and having just a gay old time. So when she was alone in a corner, he got up and began beating her loud enough that everyone soon became aware. I wonder how everyone reacted to him just suddenly coming up out of his coffin. I would have taken off running. For the rest of the funeral, in fact, he acted as if it was just a big joke and a surprise party. Oh, good. You're back. I'm not sure why people stayed after that. I know there wasn't a lot to do then, but I don't deal with buffoonery. Before his actual death in 1806, Lord Dexter managed to self-publish several books that had so many errors that he added 11 pages of punctuation marks for them to, and I quote, "They may peeper and salt it as they please." I will end with a poem that he had written about himself. Lord Dexter is a man of fame, most celebrated is his name. More precious far than gold that's pure. Lord Dexter shine forevermore. Well, Mirror, I asked for funny and you did not disappoint. I laughed, I cried, and I felt better about all my own decisions. I hoped you all enjoyed learning about the lucky fool that was the false Lord, Timothy Dexter. Have a happy Easter, Shane, and everyone else. Enjoy your candy. Remember, rabbits are a 10-year commitment. And it's a lot harder to catch a chicken than you might think. Trust me.
As we continue our journey, we stumble upon a quaint village where the houses are made of chocolate eggs and candy. Here we encounter our third character, Chocolina, a sweet and bubbly chocolatier.
Greetings, traveler. Feel free to sample my Easter treats. They are crafted with love, and each bite contains a touch of enchantment.
We savor Chocolina's delicate confections, the rich, velvety chocolate melting in our mouths, and we feel a warmth spread through our body. Suddenly, Peter appears from Frightful to join in on the chocolate goodness and to share our next story.
Tonight I'll be taking you back to the 19th century for a case of ghosts and murder where nothing is as it seems. This is the case of the fake yet still deadly ghost of Hammersmith. Toward the end of November 1803, something frightening was being reported in Hammersmith, which at the time was a small village on the outskirts of London. Locals were claiming to have seen a ghostly spectre drifting through the dark streets at night. Rumor was that this was the ghost of a villager who had committed suicide the year before by slitting his own throat. One pregnant woman claimed she'd been crossing the churchyard when she saw this spirit rise up from the tombstone. It grabbed her as she ran away. People were terrified, and during those wintry months of 1803, you had to be brave or mad to walk the streets of Hammersmith at night. Until a group of young men gathered rifles and pistols to take down this supernatural being. And so on the 3rd of January 1804, a 29-year-old excise officer joined the spooky hunt. His name was Francis Smith, and on that fateful night he was armed with a fowling piece, a shotgun designed for shooting wild birds. He headed out into the streets hunting for the spirit and found himself in a part of Hammersmith called Black Lion Lane, near the River Thames. But at the exact same time, a 22-year-old man called Thomas Millwood was leaving his parents' house. He was a bricklayer and was heading out to pick up his wife from a late job. He didn't want her walking these haunted streets alone. And Thomas's outfit for work was a white shirt, a white flannel waistcoat, a white apron, and freshly washed white linen trousers. Perhaps you can see where this is going. I read the court transcripts, which state that it had been an exceptionally dark night, and the lane where the encounter took place was narrow and ran between two high hedges. I also checked the phases of the moon for that evening. On January the 4th, 1804, the moon was in its last quarter, not full but big enough to cast an eerie glow across the city and over the white clothes of Thomas. The two men stumbled upon one another at the junction where Black Lion Lane meets Beaver Lane. And poor old Thomas simply turned the corner and saw a random man holding a gun in the darkness. But Francis saw the white, ghostly figure that had terrorized London. And shocked at the sight of this spectre, Francis started to shout demands, saying, "Damn you, who are you, what are you? Damn you, I'll shoot you." And this is where Thomas Millwood made a fatal choice. He began to walk closer to Francis. Maybe he hadn't realized the danger he was in, or hadn't even seen the gun in the darkness. But he knew about the weapon soon enough when a second later Francis aimed the barrel at the spirit and pulled the trigger. The street boomed as shots scattered into a deadly pattern around Thomas, and the man, dressed all in white, who just wanted to walk his wife home, fell to the floor, dead. Now, once he was shot, Francis Smith was shaken, yes, but he was excited. He had killed the ghost of Hammersmith. And at 10:30 p.m., he sprang off to tell people of his success. He gathered some men to come to see this spirit he had destroyed, and they all raced back and saw the reality of the situation. Lying in the street, his face staring upward at the moon, was the very real corpse of a human being, Thomas Millwood. He'd been shot in the lower part of the jaw on the left side, and the impact had broken that jaw and penetrated the vertebra of his neck, injuring his spinal marrow. It was, as court records would state later, a mortal wound. The gravity of the situation started to sink in for Francis Smith as the men called for the High Constable to come and advise. And Francis just paced back and forth, agitated, saying,
I didn't know it was a person. I didn't know.
The constable arrived and immediately told Francis Smith to go home and wait, which he did. Then the men lifted the shattered corpse of Thomas Millwood and carried him to the nearby Black Lion Inn and set his corpse down, probably on a table or perhaps the floor. Thomas would have spent many a night here drinking with his parents and wife, but now he lay dead. Yet this was no ordinary murder, because there was no mystery. Francis Smith had done this. But was he actually guilty of murder? An inquest was carried out right there in the inn, and it came to the only conclusion they felt was possible, that Francis Smith had indeed willfully murdered Thomas Millwood in the street. Ghost or no ghost, the coroner announced that Francis would stand trial at the Old Bailey for murder. The trial began, and the witnesses were called, testifying to what they saw that night, but also of the ghost stories leading up to it. The court records confirmed that there were actually several ghost hunting parties out that very night. One man who attended the corpse, a night watchman, admitted that he had seen the ghost himself on the Thursday before. Another local told the court that this ghost had attacked him in the churchyard, leaping up from behind a tombstone and grabbing him by the throat. And it was even said in that courtroom that on account of his white clothes, Thomas Millwood had already been mistaken for the Hammersmith ghost on 2 previous occasions, so much so that his family had advised him to wear a long coat whenever he went out at night. Anne Millwood also took the stand. She was the sister of Thomas, and she had heard the entire exchange between Thomas and Francis. She said this:
I ran out of the door, and when I got halfway from my father's house to my brother's, I saw my brother laying dead at the gate. I took hold of his right hand and said, "Speak to me," but he could not, and his head was laying towards me as I went up to him.
The jury retired for about 3/4 of an hour and returned with a verdict of manslaughter. But the Lord Chief Baron told them that this option was simply not available to them. They would have to find the prisoner either guilty or not guilty of murder, because in a case where someone has deliberately shot another, there was no in-between. And so the jury discussed it again and came back with a devastating verdict. Francis Smith was guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to hang, and his body would be given to the medical college to be dissected afterwards. He left the courtroom with little hope, but there was a great amount of public sympathy for him, and after an agonizing few weeks, Francis heard the news he had prayed for. Despite the deliberate shooting, those ghostly elements meant that this was not a cold-blooded murder after all, and he was granted a stay of execution and was offered a pardon, if and only if he served a year hard labor in prison. And what of the ghost of Hammersmith who started all this? Well, the publicity surrounding the shooting and court case caused a local shoemaker to come forward. His name was John Graham, and he admitted to dressing as a ghost to scare villagers. He did this to take revenge on his apprentices because they had told Graham's children some scary ghost stories. It seemed that the Hammersmith ghost was no more, until 1824 when reports began that the ghost had returned to Hammersmith, only this time it could breathe fire. The ghost was sighted up until the 1830s, until a new supernatural figure took its place, Spring-Heeled Jack. Yet those who say the Hammersmith ghost never existed might have some caution, because after Thomas Millward was shot, there have been reports of his spirit haunting the Black Lion Inn, where his corpse lay on that night. The landlord of the inn in 2004 told the BBC that there had been a strange voice speaking to people in the pub, and yet no one was there to speak it. Perhaps the clearly fake ghost of Hammersmith ended up creating a very real ghost who still wanders those streets after all these years, searching for a wife he will never find.
We leave the village with a spring in our step and soon arrive at a serene lake, shimmering with the golden light of the setting sun. Here we meet our fourth character, Ripple, a wise and gentle water spirit.
Welcome, traveler. My lake is a place of reflection, a respite for those who seek inner peace. Allow yourself a moment to be still and let the water's tranquility wash over you.
We pause at the lake's edge, the water's calming embrace, soothing our soul. Suddenly appearing on a small boat on the lake is Bill and Kristen from Mind Over Murder.
On this episode of Mind Over Murder, we're discussing Wally Thrasher, the notorious drug smuggler from Virginia's New River Valley. During the 1970s and 1980s, Thrasher transported marijuana and cocaine into the United States from South America, working under some of the biggest drug kingpins in South Florida. According to Ron Peterson, author of Chasing the Squirrel, by 1974, Thrasher was one of the highest-paid drug smuggling pilots in the business, earning up to $96,000 per plane load of weed.
Hailing from Pulaski, Virginia, Thrasher was a criminally handsome, charming, and gifted athlete. He was known as the Squirrel for being wily and elusive. He served in the U.S. Navy for 3 years before being honorably discharged. He attended Virginia Tech for less than a year before deciding to forge his own path without further education.
After marriage, a child, a divorce, and a stint owning a hippie clothing store called the Hydraulic Buffalo, Thrasher finally found his niche when he took flying lessons in Roanoke, Virginia. He earned both his private and commercial pilot certificates and moved to Florida to pursue his new career, eventually saving up enough to buy his own airplane, a twin-engine Beech 18.
In 1972, Wally Thrasher was introduced to Ken Bernstein, who hired Thrasher to run loads of weed from Mexico or the Caribbean to Fort Lauderdale. Waiting vans would take the drugs north on Interstate 95.
Thrasher was wildly successful and was making money hand over fist, though his career wasn't without its problems, including a 2-year stint in a Mexican prison. He worked for various kingpins throughout Florida until 1977 when he married his third wife, Olga Wright.
After his marriage, he tried very hard to get out of the business in order to go legit. He attended real estate classes and tried a series of business adventures, all of which failed. Eventually, he got back into the smuggling business to earn money for his growing family. By the end of 1979, Wally Thrasher was running drugs for 46-year-old kingpin Frank Brady, who was well on his way to building the largest drug smuggling operation on the East Coast.
Thrasher again wanted out of the smuggling game for the safety of his family. He tried once more for a career out of the drug smuggling biz. He and Olga opened up a furniture store called Captain's Catch Furniture. First a legitimate business, and then a shell corporation for laundering his smuggling profits. Back into the game Thrasher went.
This time he had a few close calls, including ending up in jail in the Bahamas. Olga had to buy his way out of the Bahamian prison to the tune of $50,000. In 1982, Olga and Thrasher decided moving to their home in Virginia full-time was the best option for their family. Thrasher suggested that he fly the drugs into Virginia instead. It was a much shorter road trip between Virginia and New York.
By the spring of 1983, Wally was a bona fide drug smuggling ringleader, heading up operations in Virginia. They started small, flying in 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of weed into the NRV airport a few times a month.
Thrasher was also mentoring a co-pilot named Nelson King, who made the trips back and forth to Belize with him for drugs. While King wasn't the most skilled pilot out there, he was calm and steady, and he made a good backup for Thrasher when he needed a quick catnap on a long flight.
In October of 1984, Thrasher was set to make a run to Belize to pick up a load of pot. A death in the family forced him to curtail his plan, so he allowed Nelson King to make the run, along with smuggling associate and close friend Mark Bailey as co-pilot. At this point, King had been co-pilot with Thrasher on 4 flights. He extensively planned every aspect of the trip with the two men, laying out that they would make the run over 2 days, flying from Virginia to Florida for a refueling stop, then Florida to Belize, where they would pay $250,000 for the pot and fly it back to Virginia.
The first part of the flight went smoothly. The second part did not. King did not hand over the $250,000 to Thrasher's contacts in Belize. King said Thrasher had instructed him that the load was to be fronted, that is, paid for in full later. Thrasher had such a stellar reputation with his Belize contact that they agreed and allowed the two men to take off with the 1,200 pounds of Belize Breeze pot and the $250,000.
The trip back to Virginia ended in disaster. King attempted to avoid fog over Fancy Gap Mountain in Virginia by flying under the weather, a dangerous practice, rather than attempting to climb over it as Thrasher had instructed. King, not good at reading instrument panels, tried to navigate visually, but found himself unable to do it because of the fog. He crashed the plane into the side of Fancy Gap Mountain, going 175 miles an hour.
The plane broke into 4 pieces. Mark Bailey was burned to literal ashes in the ensuing inferno. Nelson King miraculously survived.
Limping away from the crash site, King called Thrasher to come to his rescue. Thrasher came to the panicky realization that the plane full of pot would shortly be traced to him, as would the injured pilot. He burned all paperwork that linked him to the aircraft, the logbooks, the bill of sale for the plane, and the maintenance records. He loaded King into his truck and drove 13 hours to a hospital in Florida. They decided on the story that King had been injured in a motorcycle accident.
As expected, Thrasher's plane was traced back to him within 48 hours of the crash, as was the identity of Mark Bailey via dental records. Hoping to recoup his losses for the load of pot and unaware that King had stolen $250,000, Thrasher made a call to Belize to ask if he could fly down for another load. When he learned of King's double cross, he went in search for his associate, but no dice. King was now in the wind.
Thrasher decided to go back to Virginia to sell a significant stash of pot that he had stored in a shed at Claytor Lake in order to pay off the debt that he owed his contacts in Belize. He called a smuggling associate, Joe Selby, and offered him the pot, which was worth about $300,000. Selby agreed to buy it, but only for $150,000. Between a rock and a hard place and needing to pay back his debt, Thrasher agreed.
But the double crossing wasn't done. Thrasher and Selby stopped at a New Jersey motel overnight on their way to New York to sell the load of pot. While Thrasher slept, Selby absconded with the product and the van. Thrasher now owed $250,000 to a Belizean kingpin. He was being hunted by authorities. He had lost his favorite plane and was now out another $300,000 worth of pot.
Unable to do anything else, Thrasher flew to Belize to meet with his contact and convinced him to front him one more load of pot to sell in order to pay back his debts.
Thrasher did not return home as planned on November 5th. Finally, on November 8th, one of his Florida associates, Dickie Synott, called Olga and reported bad news. Wally had been in a plane crash in Jamaica. The fire had burned so hot that Wally had been incinerated. There was nothing left of him but his wedding ring, which Dickie brought back to Olga unscathed.
Olga, heartbroken and bereft, did the only thing she could do, arranged a funeral for her husband. But even at the funeral, groups of Wally's friends whispered that they didn't think Wally was dead. He was pulling an audacious stunt to avoid legal trouble over the plane crash and the drug smuggling. They firmly believed the squirrel was still alive. The federal government didn't buy that Wallace Thrasher had died in the plane crash. They set up a federal grand jury to look into Thrasher's business dealings. When she was subpoenaed to appear in front of a federal grand jury to discuss her husband's business dealings, she pled the fifth and was held in contempt of court. The grand jury found that Wallace Samuel Thrasher was guilty of a dozen instances of smuggling drugs in addition to tax evasion.
Olga Thrasher found herself in the hot seat, being questioned about her husband's business transactions. Eventually, in an effort to save herself and her family, she became a federal informant.
All the while, Olga continued wondering what happened to her husband. Was he still alive? The FBI, the DEA, Customs, and the U.S. Marshals were all actively looking for Thrasher. FBI, DEA, and VSP agents who worked on this case all have different theories. Some believe he died in a crash in Belize. Others believe he faked his own death to go into hiding, but has died since then. Still others believe he's gone off the grid and is alive today.
The U.S. Marshals actively hunted for Wally Thrasher, following up on tips and sightings until 2015, when the U.S. Attorney filed a motion in Roanoke to dismiss the open warrant for Thrasher's arrest. He stated that available evidence showed Thrasher to be deceased, and there was no further reason to keep the warrant open.
Wally Thrasher would be 83 years old today. Is he still somewhere out there living his best life? Or did he die in a fiery plane crash in 1984? Much like the notorious case of skyjacker D.B. Cooper, we will never really know the answer.
For more information on the fascinating case of Wally Thrasher, pick up Chasing the Squirrel by Ron Peterson, available on Amazon or wherever books are sold.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
With renewed purpose, we set off on the next leg of our journey, traversing a whimsical forest of towering candy canes and marshmallow mushrooms. Our path is illuminated by the soft, magical glow of fairy lights. In the heart of this sugar-coated wonderland, we encounter our fifth character, Sir Sticky, a dashing, chivalrous candy cane knight.
Hail, traveler! Be on your guard, for this forest is full of surprises. Stay true to your path, and you'll reach the heart of the Enchanted Easterlands.
With a firm grasp of our newfound courage, we thank Sir Sticky and press onward. Just as Sir Sticky dashes out of sight, Robin appears. From the trail went cold. It's good to see a familiar face, and he has our next story.
So one of the most controversial and divisive topics in the world today is the death penalty. Obviously, one of the biggest arguments against the death penalty is that there's always a risk of an innocent person being executed for a crime they did not commit. But if you want a more extreme version of this scenario, what if an innocent person was sentenced to death for murdering someone who turned out to be alive? Or even worse, what if the so-called victim's family hated the defendant's family so much that they intentionally faked the victim's death in order to frame the defendant and hoped to see him executed for a murder that never happened? Well, believe it or not, this exact scenario actually occurred. Yes, there have been documented cases of innocent people being executed for supposedly murdering a victim who turned out to be alive, but these incidents mostly occurred over a century or two ago. However, this particular case took place during the 1980s in Uganda. At the start of the decade, 27-year-old Edward Edmari Mapagi lived in Uganda's capital city of Kampala and had a wife and 6 children. He ran a successful taxi business, but after an incident in which his taxi was stolen at gunpoint, Edward decided to relocate his family to the village of Kayambala, where he had grown up. They moved in with Edward's father, and he quickly established himself as one of the village's most well-respected citizens. But on June the 12th, 1981, everyone was taken by complete surprise when Edward and his cousin, Fred Masembe, were arrested and charged with murder. The alleged victim was George William Wandiaka, who went by his middle name and was one of Edward's neighbors in Kayambala. Edward and Fred were both accused of robbing William and stabbing him to death. 1 year after their arrests, the two men were taken to trial for William's murder, where they were both found guilty and sentenced to death. The two defendants continued to maintain their innocence and seemed to have one fairly convincing piece of evidence in their favor, namely, the fact that Edward was certain he had seen William standing in the courtroom during the trial. Maybe it's just me, but I do feel that if someone is being tried for murder, the victim not actually being dead should probably be enough to generate reasonable doubt. Regardless, I'm sure the courts just thought that Edward was hallucinating or making up any ridiculous story he could to save himself, as both he and Fred were sent to death row at Lizira Maximum Security Prison in order to await execution. Now, when someone is sentenced to death in the United States, it will usually be many years before their execution goes through, as they are entitled to file numerous appeals. And once they run out of legal options, an execution date is officially set for them, so the defendant will at least know when they are scheduled to die. However, that's not how the system worked in Uganda back in the 1980s, as condemned prisoners were taken to death row, but not given any information about when they were scheduled to die. They would only find out when someone suddenly showed up and dragged them out of their cell, informing them that they were going to be executed in 3 days via hanging. So you can imagine the psychological torture of being on death row for years, never knowing if this was the week you were going to die. Edward would later say that he witnessed a total of 52 inmates get taken from their cells and executed in this fashion, and they would often do this with batches of 10 or 11 prisoners at a time. This experience was pure hell for Edward and Fred, and while Fred's execution never went through, he wound up developing malaria and stomach complications. Since Fred was a condemned prisoner who was going to die anyway, prison authorities did not feel the need to provide him with proper medical treatment, so he passed away in 1985. To make things even more tragic, Edward's wife also died while he was incarcerated. Well, as time went on, it appeared that Edward's account about having seen William in the courtroom might have actually been true, as numerous sightings started pouring in from witnesses who were certain they had seen William at various locations throughout Uganda. In 1989, 8 years after William's murder supposedly took place, the authorities finally uncovered conclusive evidence that he was alive and living in the village of Mabiko, as he sometimes took trips back to Kayambala in order to visit his family. So how in the world could something like this have happened? Well, since this story took place in Uganda, there are not exactly an abundance of English language sources available out there, so certain details are very vague. But the gist of it seems to be that William Wandiaka's parents had a major grudge against Edward Mapagi's father. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find out exactly what this grudge was, only that it was based around a land dispute, but it was apparently serious enough that William's family believed that going to the trouble of faking his death in order to frame Edward for his non-existent murder was the most appropriate way to handle it. You might be wondering how they pulled something like this off, but apparently, they bribed witnesses to say that they had seen Edward and Fred kill William and dispose of his body. And their frame-up job was given additional credibility when they bribed a pathologist to falsely testify that he had done a post-mortem on William's body. I'm not sure why the defense team never asked to see the body or any other corroborating evidence to prove that a crime took place, but it's good to know that the courts were totally fine with sentencing 2 innocent men to death on the basis of one witness who testified, "Dude, take my word for it, it was totally a murder." Unfortunately, as is often the case in many wrongful conviction stories, the higher powers did not want to admit that they had made a colossal mistake. So even after the Attorney General of Uganda was given conclusive evidence that no murder ever took place and the so-called victim was still alive, Edward continued to languish on death row for another 11 years, as it's apparently very difficult to overturn a conviction in that country. It was not until July of 2000 when Edward finally received a full pardon from the president of Uganda and was released from prison, but by that point, he had spent 19 years behind bars for a crime that never happened. Not surprisingly, Edward has become a major activist for abolishing the death penalty, and his story is considered to be one of the worst miscarriages of justice the world has ever seen. And if you're wondering what happened to William Wandiaka, he actually wound up dying of natural causes in 2002, 2 years after Edward was released, and hopefully, William's family didn't try to frame anyone again. Edward never got the opportunity to confront William, and that's probably the best outcome for everyone involved, since I think there's a good chance that Edward would have wound up going back to death row for a real murder.
As we make our way through the enchanted forest, we come across a beautiful garden where the grass is a lush emerald green and the trees are adorned with shimmering silver leaves. It is here that we meet our sixth character, Melodia, a songbird with a voice so enchanting it could heal the heart of the most troubled soul.
Welcome, traveler. My songs are an expression of love and harmony. Listen, and let the melody infuse your spirit with joy.
We pause to appreciate Melodia's tunes, and our hearts are filled with a sense of contentment and unity. Appearing now at the call of Melodia's tune is Kristen from the Hidden Staircase with our next story.
It's officially springtime, and along with it comes Easter and all of the flowers popping open. You may even feel the urge to run through a field of them and enjoy being high on life. The man in my story today was often high on more than life, and wrote one of the most popular books ever because of it. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which happens to be my personal favorite. This was all when LSD was still legal, but when he was busted for marijuana, he decided to fake his death and escape to Mexico. The author's name is Ken Kesey, and his success began when he participated in a CIA-ran psychoactive drug test, during which he was exposed to drugs like LSD and cocaine. The trials were only temporary, but he became hungry to further his distortions of reality. Ken soon became engulfed in a world of LSD, pills, THC, mushrooms, and peyote, later even attributing the success of his famous book to his participation in the drug test, and further personal tests afterward. If you've read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. During his escapades, Ken became friends with like-minded people who dubbed themselves the Merry Pranksters. Together, they began to study the effects of the mind-altering medication by traveling in a roadshow on an altered school bus known as the Further. They used the Further to express themselves and spread the word about a lifestyle based on freedom of self and creating art out of daily life. Riders in the trippy bus shared in a plethora of mind-altering substances while road noise was piped in through the speakers from the outside, and their conversations were blasted through a speaker on the outside. As Ken said, their motto was freedom of body and mind, no matter what the law states. They played a massive part in the blooming of hippie culture and the success of the Grateful Dead, who were essentially the house band of the pranksters. As you can imagine, authorities didn't usually react kindly to a rainbow bus full of tripping people. Sadly for Ken, when he was found with marijuana in his possession, he was arrested 2 separate times in an effort to not only crack down on marijuana users, but also the widespread influence Kesey seemed to have. As a result, an arrest warrant was issued for Ken in 1966. Not for the Further or for LSD, but just over marijuana possession. That began a several-month-long ploy to evade arrest and prosecution. And it started with the author faking his death. To do so, Ken drove the further to a secluded cliffside along the coast of California and left a suicide note that read, "Ocean, ocean, I'll beat you in the end. I'll break you this time. I'll go through with my heels at your hungry ribs." Then, with the help of his pranksters, Ken lay in the trunk of a getaway car and was driven to Mexico. Ken evaded the FBI and the federals in Mexico for 8 months. He was traveling to several towns, including Puerto Vallarta and a place known as Marijuana City. His time on the lam was filled with sunshine and a plethora of THC. Eventually, Ken grew tired of his life in Mexico, and with the continued help of the pranksters, he returned to California. Then one day, as he was driving, a couple of police officers recognized him and quickly pulled him over. Ken jumped from his truck and once again attempted to flee arrest. The officers chased him down a steep embankment, over a fence, and eventually apprehended him after a 5-block pursuit. Ken Kesey was finally caught and sentenced to 5 months in an experimental redwoods work camp, clearing brush. After serving time, Ken moved to Pleasant Hill, Oregon, and began a more secluded life with his family. However, he still managed to write and eventually made a second trippy bus in the 90s to accompany his memoir based on his time on the first bus. His actual death occurred on October 21st, 2001, after complications from liver surgery. Ken lives on today through his writings and is known as one of the most influential authors in history. Unfortunately, through his efforts to avoid arrest, he fled longer than his actual punishment. It seemed to be enough to set him on the straight and narrow, or at least be a lot less public about his mind-altering lifestyle.
Our journey then leads us to a grand, glistening palace made of crystal, where we meet our 7th character, King Arulus, a wise and benevolent ruler whose kindness knows no bounds.
Greetings, traveler. My palace is a symbol of hope and light, shining bright even in the darkest times. May your journey be filled with courage and resilience.
King Arulus allows us to rest tonight within his beautiful palace. Before we end this night, do you mind if I share a story myself? I mentioned at the beginning that I am a crime podcaster, but I also am a history podcaster, and I'd like to share a quick story to end the night for my show, Hometown History.
Hello? 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 Let me out! Hello? Hello?
This is the sound of a resurrection. This is actual audio from the funeral of an Irishman named Shay Bradley in Dublin, Ireland.
Is that priest I can hear? Let me out! Hello? Hello? Stop, I can hear you!
And yes, it's coming from inside the coffin, from the bottom of a 6-foot hole.
Hello, please! Hello? Who's there? Hello.
The family is surrounding the graveside, 5 to 10 people deep. The initial shock is giving way to laughter that grows as more people realize what's happening.
Easy, Shavy, I'm in the box. No, God. You gotta hear that. Hello again. Hello.
Shortly before his death, Bradley had recorded this message to be played from his casket for one last laugh with his loved ones. But sometimes it's not so funny, because sometimes it's real. This is actual audio from another graveside, and notice no one is laughing.
Por revivirlo.
Y levántate de los muertos, que te alumbrará Cristo. Padre, en el nombre de Jesús, venimos orando, Señor, en este momento, Padre.
In July of 2016, pregnant teenager Nicey Perez collapsed in the middle of the night on her way to the bathroom. The sound of gunfight in a nearby street triggered a stress reaction, either a panic attack or what is known as a cataphylactic episode, in which the victim's body shuts down in response to trauma, a kind of waking coma. Within an hour, Nicey was pronounced dead and buried on the following day in an above-ground vault in the town of La Entrada, Honduras. The day after the burial, muffled screams were heard in the area of the tomb. Her mother would later say, "As I put my hand on her grave, I could hear noises inside. I heard banging. Then I heard her voice. She was screaming for help."
Por revivirlo.
Y levántate de los muertos, que te alumbrará Cristo. Padre, en el nombre de Jesús, venimos orando, Señor, en este momento.
What you hear is a circle of people attempting to perform CPR. In the next video, Nicey does not look dead, but by the time she's rushed to the hospital, she's gone. Oxygen deprived may have been the final cause of death. According to her mother, even after a day in the tomb, the color of her body was normal. Her corpse didn't smell. She just looked like she was in a deep sleep. There was no rigor mortis. Her body was still flexible. It was impossible that she had been dead for so many hours. Tragically, there are countless other examples from history of this type of halfway resurrection. In 2011, in Kazan, Russia, a woman named Makomek Zayanov sat up in her casket in the middle of her own funeral. The shock of that experience led to a second heart attack, which was unfortunately fatal. History is full of stories like this, and there are times, of course, where people do it on purpose. Sometimes they fake their death, as in many of these other stories. Sometimes it's a performance. Harry Houdini had himself buried alive to prove that he could escape even the grave. As it turned out, he could not escape the grave, and he had to be rescued when he nearly died for real. Years later, in Fresno, California, a Houdini admirer named Joe Burris would attempt the same feat with a twist. He would have 6,000 pounds of wet concrete poured on top of his casket. Amazing Joe was a struggling magician looking for his big break, so he invited a camera crew to cover his escape. More than 150 people were in attendance. This footage would later be used by television programs, like A Current Affair, to tell Joe's story.
And then buried alive under 7 tons of dirt and cement. but something goes terribly wrong. Exclusive, the greatest show of Amazing Joe. All of Joe's family was there to witness his greatest moment, and they were videotaping it so they could cherish it forever. But as our Mike Watkins tells us, something happened that turned this video into a horror movie.
In the video, you can see Joe wince as a uniformed police officer cuffs his hands in front of him. And it's clearly not an act. The cuffs are too tight, but it wouldn't have mattered anyway.
Through the chains, through the shackles, through the handcuffs, I burrow my way through 3.5 feet of dirt. To get through all this before the cement hardened.
A reporter covering the events asked Joe if he understands the full implications of what he's about to attempt here. It's clear that he does not. He tries to play off the awkward moment with a joke, but it's obvious that he's in over his head.
You realize that cement starts to harden first at the lower elevation, so it's going to be hard. You mean it hardens at the lower part? I thought it started at the top. No, it hardens at the top. No. In fact, I shouldn't even kid. This is very serious. This is no magic trick like you've been seeing tonight.
Your heart sinks as you watch them pour concrete, 6,000 pounds of it, on top of Joe in his frail plastic coffin at the bottom of a 7-foot hole. For context, 6,000 pounds is roughly the same weight as the largest SUVs, or 2 Volkswagen Beetles. Almost immediately after being filled to the top, the concrete drops 1.5 feet. The plastic coffin has collapsed. By the time rescuers reached him, by digging a second hole beside the first, Joe has passed away.
He told me just a few days before that something Houdini said that was, it will either be fate or my foolishness that kills me, and it was Houdini's foolishness and Joe's too.
As easy as it is to criticize someone like Joe, we all do foolish things. If we're lucky, we survive them. And this may seem like an unusual takeaway from stories like these, but they really just make me glad to be alive. Life is precious, and we can waste a lot of time and energy trying to impress people or pulling stupid stunts that are really just attempts to feel alive. What I'm reminded of when I hear stories like this is that we're already alive. We already have a lot to be grateful for. And the older I get, the more I look at every morning as a little resurrection. I think of all the people who didn't wake up on that day or any other day, who didn't come back from the darkness, and I feel grateful that I did. So I make a commitment just to be completely present in the present, and ironically, that's one of the things that history helps us do. Happy Easter, everyone. Hello again, friend. Thank you for joining me tonight in what was part 1 in this 2-part special collaboration Easter episode. I'm Shane Waters, the organizer and creator of these collaborations, and I truly hope that you enjoy them. If you do, consider leaving a review for this podcast wherever you're listening. If this isn't your cup of tea, well, then my name is George. And forget all about that whole review thing, won't you? Remember, all podcasts that you heard are listed in the show notes in order of appearance, along with a link on where to find them. I'll see you soon. Hello, and welcome back, friend. I'm glad you can join me again for the second half of our collaboration Easter special. I'm Shane Waters, the host of Foul Play Crime Series. If you haven't listened to part 1 of this episode, I suggest you do so, and then rejoin me here. Remember, all podcasts are listed in the episode show notes, along with a link on where to find them. Now that that's out of the way, let's get on with it. As we continue our adventure, venturing into a grove of talking trees, the trees sway gently as they share ancient tales and riddles. And it's here we meet our 8th character, Whisper, a mysterious figure shrouded in a cloak made of leaves.
Hello, traveler. The trees hold secrets of ages past. Listen carefully, and you may uncover hidden wisdom.
As we converse with Whisper and the talking trees, we gain invaluable insight into the history of the Enchanted Easterlands and the interconnectedness of all life. Walking out behind a talking tree is Brittany and John from Wicked Deeds, with the first story of our journey.
Nicholas Alaverdian was born on July 11, 1987, to parents Diana and Jack, who he described as alcoholic and abusive. During his youth, Nick's parents ended up separating, with he and his siblings going with Mom. In 1996, Diana married a man named David Rossi. Together, they began building a new life, which one would hope to be free from abuse now that Jack was out of the picture. At this point, you might think that now was the time for Nicholas to flourish, but sadly, that's not the case. Nick continued to struggle and suffered from a variety of mental health issues, including narcissistic personality disorder and attention deficit disorder. As a child, he was said to have episodes, I guess you would call them. He'd yell, scream, hit people, and spit at them.
Yeah, but I wonder how much of that was influenced by his dad.
I mean, especially when you're a child and you have very little sense of right and wrong. But even saying that, his behavior eventually reached a fever pitch with David, who supposedly beat Nick during a trip to Disney. Shortly after this incident, around the age of 12, Nicholas Alaverdian was entered into the Rhode Island foster care system. Once in foster care, Nick began staying in something called the night-to-night placement program and was bounced all over the place. But a little while after his placement, he started going to the Rhode Island State House fairly regularly, which by the age of 14 landed him a position there as a legal page. Nick described his time at the State House as a, quote, place I could be safe from maltreatment and suffering, end quote.
But even with his newfound sanctuary, Nicholas wasn't out of the woods and claimed he was still being placed in homes where he was yet again abused.
I understand kids aren't always taken seriously, but I wonder if he tried to reach out for help.
It's possible that he did, but Rhode Island authorities have stated that there was no proof that this abuse took place.
I guess you have to take it with a grain of salt, though, because I'm sure there's plenty of abuse that goes undetected.
Oh, I totally agree, but let me just give you a little bit more insight into what Alaverdian was alleging. In an article with Turn to 10 in 2011, Alaverdian stated, quote, "I was subjected to torture, beatings, assault in various forms. I was refused to contact anybody at all," end quote. And that same article goes on to state that Alaverdian claims he was transferred to several other states, including Florida and Nebraska, where instances of abuse continued to occur until his release from DCYF in 2005. Now, let's fast forward to 2011, which seemed to be a big year for Alaverdian in his battle against abuse. He filed a federal lawsuit against DCYF, numerous facilities and individuals, and the states of Florida and Nebraska. In 2013, that lawsuit was settled by the parties involved, with most of the specifics regarding the settlement being kept private. Now, you might be asking, well, what happened between 2005 and 2011? The answer to that is there's a lot.
For some reason, I have a funny feeling about this guy.
Why is that?
I mean, he seems to have had the cards stacked against him since the beginning, but if all that alleged abuse and mental health issues went unchecked, it kind of sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Well, it turns out that Nicholas Alaverdian wasn't the societal champion that many articles made him out to be. In 2008, Nick had made his way onto police's radar for pinning one of his female classmates against the wall of a stairwell while groping her and masturbating.
Forget what I said. I've lost all sympathy for this guy regarding his past.
Mm-hmm.
I understand lashing out when you're a kid, but now that you're an adult, you can't be pulling that shit.
Well, later on that year, Alaverdian was convicted of those crimes, and he was forced to register as a sex offender.
I guess that's a plus.
Yeah, and just to note, Nick did end up trying to get a retrial, but that was totally shot down by the judge. Now, let's jump ahead a bit more. While living in Rhode Island in 2010, Alaverdian ended up getting arrested for domestic simple assault against a female partner, and when taken into custody, he supposedly smashed his head against the bars in the back of the cruiser and wouldn't stop until the cops pepper sprayed him.
This guy's not only a dirtbag, but he's a drama queen.
You're not kidding. And just to note, he ended up pleading no contest to the domestic charge. Now, this portion is a little foggy, but it seems as though around this same time, Nick had also gotten married and shortly thereafter divorced.
I can't imagine why.
Right? And after that divorce, Nick married another woman for them to only divorce less than a year later. She went on to say that Alaverdian was extremely abusive during their marriage.
I mean, as bad as this guy is, I still can't help but think that some of the stuff that he's doing is because of who his father was.
Yeah, absolutely. But it doesn't mean that because his father was this way that he has to act in this way too.
Right, I agree.
Now, fast forward again to around 2018-2019, when Alaverdian decided to move to the UK, where he met a woman named Miranda, whom he married in early 2020.
So, am I the only one getting you vibes here? Do we have Joe Goldberg fleeing the US to London to try and leave his past behind?
It certainly seems that way. Aside from Alaverdian and Miranda's marriage, 2020 was also marked by two other significant events: the COVID-19 pandemic and Nicholas's alleged diagnosis of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Alleged diagnosis?
Yes, alleged. In early 2020, Alaverdian had reached out to American media outlets to inform them of his diagnosis. Totally something a normal person would do, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously.
Well, shortly after sending those transmissions, on February 29th, 2020, Nicholas Alaverdian allegedly succumbed to his illness. His obituary stated, quote, "His last words were, 'Fear not, and run towards the bliss of the sun.' At the time of his passing, the room was filled with the sounds of the end credits for the 1997 film Contact by composer Alan Silvestri, a film and score which held special meaning for Mr. Alaverdian." End quote.
Okay. That had to be written by him.
I mean, I honestly would not doubt it. And that's only a little snippet from the obituary, too. I suggest anyone listening to give it a read. There was also an amusing comment in a Providence Journal piece that stated, quote, "As his supposed death neared, Alaverdian pressed the storyline that his life as a crusader for children, now about to be cut short, was news that needed reporting. He insisted as much to a journal reporter and editor who chose not to write about him, much to Alaverdian's angry persistence." End quote.
Okay, hear me out for a second. Either this guy actually died, only to rise again with the intent to lead a cult revolving around the 1997 cinematic masterpiece Contact, while Alan Silvestri followed him around tickling the ivories, or Nicholas Alaverdian is not only a registered sex offender and domestic abuser, but also a con man that attempted to fake his own death.
Well, in late 2021, a man going by the name Arthur Knight had contracted a serious case of COVID-19, which landed him in a hospital in Glasgow, Scotland. But just as you may be thinking, Arthur Knight was not who he claimed to be. Shortly after Alaverdian's alleged death, U.S. authorities were onto his little scheme and were on the hunt to bring him back to the States for even more crimes that we haven't touched on yet.
I don't understand why he would even tell U.S. media sources that he was sick and dying when he could have just changed his name and lived abroad and probably went under the radar.
I mean, honestly, who knows? But once Arthur Knight was in the hospital, authorities were able to connect with Interpol and hospital employees who, through various means, were able to confirm that this Arthur Knight guy was, in fact, Nicholas Alaverdian. Around this time, Alaverdian was arrested, and after pulling some shenanigans, he was eventually locked up and has remained in a Scottish prison ever since.
Please tell me we're trying to extradite this guy.
Yes, it turns out that the U.S. is seeking extradition due to several charges, including rape and a variety of financial crimes. As of March 6th, 2023, there was supposed to be a hearing for his extradition, but he refused to get in the prison van to be transported to the courthouse.
So throw him in the van.
Honestly, I just don't get it. But due to this, that hearing seems to have been postponed. So by now, Alaverdian has been fighting the extradition for almost a year and a half, and he's clearly not an easy person to work with, as he's supposedly gone through upwards of 8 lawyers during this battle and claims this whole thing is a conspiracy against him.
So not only is he a dirtbag criminal that's a drain on society, but he's also wasting everybody's time, even while in custody.
Yes, and you honestly never know if the truth is coming out of this guy's mouth or not.
Well, I mean, he kind of seems like a pathological liar, so he's probably making half it up anyway. I just hope the extradition happens. That way his victims can see some justice and hopefully get some closure.
I completely agree. And the justice that Alaverdian's victims deserve, which was once thought to be lost due to his deception, is finally back from the dead. Now that's what I call a resurrection.
As we continue our journey, we discover a quaint little bakery nestled in the heart of a sunflower field. The air is thick with the aroma of freshly baked bread and pastries. And it's here we meet our 9th character, Baker Sunflower, a cheerful and hard-working baker who bakes loaves of bread infused with the warmth of the sun.
Welcome, traveler. Our bread is made with love and sunshine, symbolizing the nourishment of life. Please, enjoy a loaf and let it energize your spirit.
Grateful for the sustenance, we savor the warmth and flavor of the sun-kissed bread, feeling reinvigorated for the next leg of our journey. Through the baker's door comes Justin from Obscura, a true crime podcast, with a story fresh off the pan.
Listener, one of the confections most associated in my mind with Easter are marshmallows. Sometimes different colors. They seem innocent enough, but what you're about to hear is less than sweet. September 4th, 2010, Mashpee, Massachusetts. Brent McFarland was having a good weekend. His fiancée, Catherine Kate Gill, is visiting for the weekend. She traveled for it. This despite Tropical Storm Earl causing torrential rains and heavy winds.
The major storm gathering for a coastal strike. Hurricane Earl, now a massive Category 4 hurricane, is pushing a wall of wind and water across Puerto Rico and towards the mainland, with sustained winds of 135 miles per hour. Major East Coast cities, including New York and Boston, fall squarely within the storm's so-called cone of uncertainty. Well, how bad could damage from this hurricane be? Sam Champion has our report.
But by the time it reached Cape Cod, the storm lost most of its dander.
As the sun rises over Nantucket Sound behind me, early morning reports show that Hurricane Earl, which had been downgraded to a tropical storm as it approached Cape Cod, caused very little damage, a few hundred power outages, some downed power lines, and some minor flooding. Last night, as it became clear that Earl was not going to be the storm that some thought it could be.
The two make the best of it. They spend the night drinking. Noises. Strange gurgling noises. Brent wakes up. It's pushing 2 a.m., and Kate isn't in bed with him. Anyone with a significant other knows this feeling, and the usual preceding feeling to establish where they are. McFarland slips out of bed to satiate this desire. Every second from here out is important, because soon he will discover Kate Gill on the floor choking, her throat lined wall to wall with a large marshmallow.
911 recorded line. What is your emergency? Police, fire, or medical?
Medical, please.
What do you need? You need the police?
That's all I need. I need ambulance. My girlfriend's choking.
Your girlfriend shot you?
No, she's choking to death.
Okay, what's the address?
Upon finding her, McFarland dials 911, and, unfortunately for all parties involved, dispatcher Sergeant Rhonda Colburn answers the phone.
What is she choking on?
No idea. She's falling at the mouth.
She what?
Oh, at the mouth. Open up, Kate. Open up, Kate.
Do you know the Heimlich?
The dispatcher here seems lost, even clueless.
What is your name?
Yes, I'm touching her mouth to mouth. She won't respond.
What's the phone number? Is she breathing at all?
No, she's not breathing. She's not choking. Hurry, please.
All right, the ambulance is on its way.
Kate.
How old is she?
She's 39 years old. Kate. She won't open her mouth.
She won't open her mouth?
She's seizing.
She's seizing?
She's not breathing.
Okay, she's not breathing. Okay. All right, what was she choking on? I can't hear you because you're on a speakerphone.
She's peeing her pants now.
Okay. What was she choking on?
I don't know.
Okay, you need to calm down, okay? The ambulance is on its way.
McFarland could use some help. Directions on how to save his choking fiancée.
Okay. Where is she? In the bathroom?
No, she's on the kitchen floor.
She's on the kitchen floor?
Yeah.
Okay. Does she take any medications or anything?
I have no idea.
Yep. Okay.
I have no idea. Kate, don't do this to me, Kate. Kate, can you breathe?
Is she breathing?
I can't tell.
You can't tell?
Her tongue is swollen.
Her tongue is swollen? How's her color?
Huh? Her lips are blue.
Her lips are blue?
Yes, they are. She's got the middle light there.
Does she have a history of seizures?
We have no idea.
You have no idea.
Hey.
Do you think she took anything?
No. Well, I don't know. You better come over here right away. Robin, help! Kate, baby, Kate. Come on, Kate. I can't get it out of her machine. Kate.
Brent.
Yes.
Does she respond to you at all?
I think she's barely alive.
She what?
She's barely alive.
Okay, the ambulance is on its way.
To make matters worse, the EMT response has been delayed. Delayed by as much as 2 minutes. Because A, the city of Mashpee allegedly failed to post adequate street signage down the very road McFarland lives. B, torrential rains. The combination is making it difficult for rescue workers to find Brent's home.
Well, as you know where I'm at. Don't. Give me a cookie. Kate. Come on, Kate. Come on, get out. Kate. Don't do this to me, Kate. Don't do this to me, Kate. Don't do this to me, Kate. Kate, don't. Give up. I'll go away.
Brent.
What?
Is that her making that noise?
That's her. She's not trying to breathe into her.
She what? I can't hear you.
I'm trying to give her CPR, but she's not responding.
You trying to give her CPR?
She barely...
She said she was choking on something.
I'm trying to clear her throat. And she's barely breathing here. Kate.
He's doing CPR, Bill.
Kate, don't go, Kate. Don't. No, Kate, no. Kate.
As you can imagine from the audio, Catherine Gill didn't make it. A food bolus formed in her throat, and it would later be reported that Kate was intoxicated at the time. The infuriating dispatcher, Rhonda Colburn, resigned after that December. She admitted she didn't follow protocol. There were accusations that Colburn couldn't be bothered to even try to help McFarland save his fiancée. Even local sheriff James Cummings wasn't on board with this dispatcher. The Boston Herald reports Cummings said he accepts full responsibility for the actions of the dispatcher, who during a 12-minute 911 call did not provide instructions on medical procedures, including the Heimlich maneuver and CPR.
As we meander through a maze of hedges, adorned with delicate roses, we come across our 10th character, Thorn, a protective and courageous rosebush guardian.
Greetings, traveler. My duty is to safeguard the beauty and harmony of this garden. Remember, even the most delicate flowers possess strength and resilience.
With Thorn's guidance, we start to navigate the maze and come across two good friends of mine, Jerry and Tracy, from Hillbilly Horror Stories, and they are just dying to share a story with us.
Hey guys, my name's Jerry.
And Tracy.
We are Hillbilly Horror Stories. Now, we don't do a lot of true crime on our show, but for this Easter collaboration, I actually had one that's semi-close to home that I was made aware of 4 or 5 years ago. And I actually went to the house where this murder took place.
Did I go with you?
No, you did not.
Oh.
So I thought this one, for being an Easter story, this was the perfect one to do.
Okay.
And we're going to jump right into this. This is actually known around the country as the Easter Sunday Massacre. And it happened in Hamilton, Ohio, which is a little city that's kind of adjacent to Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of in that area. Man, it's a tough story, and it's one that we've only got 10 minutes to do, so we're going to jump into some story on this. So what happened was, I'll give you the basics. Easter Sunday, March 30th, 1975. That's when 41-year-old James Rupert fatally shot 11 members of his own family in his mother's house at 635 Minor Avenue in Hamilton, Ohio. Now, that is, from my understanding, still the largest one-family massacre to ever happen in the United States.
That's
11
horrible.
people from the same family. So what was the deal here? What's the problem? Well, let's talk about James Rupert, first of all. He had a troubled life, like a lot of people do. That doesn't mean you go out and kill your entire family, but just to give you some stuff that he dealt with in his background, when he was a kid, his mother, Charity, told him that she would have preferred that he would have been a daughter because that's what she wanted. But instead she got him.
Wow.
His dad, Leonard, was very abusive, had a really short temper, and he didn't really care much for his two sons. Leonard actually died, though, in 1947, and that's when James and his brother, Leonard Jr., were actually 12 and 14 respectively, were left without a father. Well, Leonard Jr. became the father figure in the family, and he constantly picked on James during their upbringing. He would often taunt him about being a weakling, and at 16 years old, James was so dissatisfied with his home life, he ran away and attempted to commit suicide by hanging himself with a sheet. He was unsuccessful and returned home.
Wow, that's terrible.
As an adult, he was only 5'6" and weighed 135 pounds. He was very average man, just kind of plain, kind of quiet. And he's lost a lot of money that he did have in the stock market crash of 73 and 74. So at 40 years old, he's living back with his mom, who was constantly harassing him about how he didn't pay rent and he needed to have his own place and she was going to evict him. He's already down on his luck, 40 years old, already had a tough life. And to add insult to injury, his brother, Leonard Jr., had an engineering degree. He had his own home that he bought in Fairfield, which is the neighboring city to Hamilton. And he had 8 children and everything seemed to be going great. Oh, and Leonard Jr.'s wife was at one time James's girlfriend.
Man, oh man.
So it's an ex-girlfriend that his brother married.
What in the heck is happening here?
So about a month before the massacre, James had inquired about buying silencers for some weapons that he had while he was buying some ammunition. He also started doing some other strange stuff, like on March 29th, 1975, which was his 41st birthday, witnesses had seen him doing some target practicing with his .22 pistol and a .22 rifle along the banks of the Great Miami River in Hamilton. That's a no-no. You can't do that out in public.
No, I wouldn't think so.
The night before the murders, James actually went out drinking, which he did almost every night. He went to the 19th Hole Cocktail Lounge, and he talked with an employee there, 28-year-old Wanda Bishop. She had later went on to say that James was frustrated about his home life and was tired of his mother talking about evicting him all the time, and he needed to solve the problem. He left at the bar at about 11 o'clock. He came back, stayed at the bar till about 2:30, and Wanda Bishop said she asked him, well, did you solve the problem? He said, no, not yet. The next day is Easter Sunday. Leonard Jr., his wife Alma, and all of their 8 children, ages 4 to 17, were at dinner at the Minor Avenue house, his mom's house. James did not come down. While they were down there doing the regular Easter stuff and doing Easter egg hunt and stuff on the lawn, James stayed upstairs in his room. But at about 4 o'clock, he loaded his .357 Magnum, his two .22 caliber handguns, and a rifle, and then he went downstairs. That's where Charity, his mom, was in the kitchen preparing sloppy joes. Not the most traditional of Easter meals, but that's what she was doing.
Gross at any meal.
Leonard Jr. and his wife Alma were in the room. Most of the other kids were in the living room. But so it was those three in the kitchen. And James walked down and he shot Leonard Jr. in the head, then shot his wife Alma. And as his mom lunged at him, he shot her twice in the chest and once in the head. He then turned the corner to the other room and he killed 11-year-old David, 9-year-old Teresa, 13-year-old Carol. Then he went into the living room where James shot his remaining nieces and nephews, Anne, who was 12, Leonard III, 17, and Michael, 16, Thomas, 15, and the youngest, John, who was 4. He then sat on the couch and he waited 3 hours before he called the police and said, someone's been shot. And when the police showed up, he was waiting out there on the porch for them. They said you couldn't hardly even walk through the small house because there were so many bodies in the floor. And this is a small house. I bet this isn't a 700 square foot house.
Oh my gosh.
And there was 11 bodies in there. Sad situation. Obviously, he wasn't right in the mind. He said that he committed every one of the murders in less than 10 minutes.
Wow.
I've heard other reports that said less than 5 minutes. On Wikipedia, it says 2 minutes. But he said it was 10 minutes. He ends up getting a trial. They had to move it 175 miles north because they said they didn't think he would get a fair trial. He was convicted of 11 murders. Now, they had, in a short period of about 4-year period, had did away with the death penalty in Ohio. So he didn't get the death penalty.
Wow.
He got 11 consecutive life sentences in jail. Back in 81, or 82, I should say, he got another trial and they ended up only convicting him of 3 of the murders.
How is that possible?
Well, they convicted him of 3 of the murders and the other ones were by insanity. I don't know how you can kill some by insanity and not.
You can't differentiate that at all.
But he was in jail, and he tried to get parole back in 1995 when he was 61 years old. That was turned down. It was again turned down when he was 71, and again when he was 81. He was denied release on all of those. But he actually died last year, June 4th of 2022, of 88 years old of natural causes.
Oh my gosh. That is crazy.
But that is the story of the Easter Massacre. And, I was telling you, when I found out about that story about 5 years ago, I used to do a lot of work in Hamilton. I had a location that I worked at in Hamilton, and somebody told me about it. And then I got the address and went over there and checked it out. And it's just a basic little 2-story white house that sits,
Are people living in that house?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. And
wow.
actually, it's funny because I saw a news article. It was a video. And they talked to the woman that lived in the house because they were curious if she had any paranormal activity or anything in the house that had, ever disturbed her or if it bothered her living there. And this was, I think she moved in, when she was living there when they did the interview, it was about 20 years after the massacre. So it was 1995, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But
she knew though, right?
She knew, but she said that she didn't experience anything at all. And, it was just strange knowing that happened, but it didn't affect their day-to-day lives.
Dude, I don't know how you could do that. How could you knowingly know that and just be okay to, I don't know, I could not do it.
I don't know, because blood soaked into the wood
gosh,
and everything in the floors. And so
that's a horrible story.
Well, all right, guys, thank you so much for listening to us, and I guess happy Easter.
Bok bok.
As we finish navigating the maze, we soon arrive at a tranquil glade, where the air is filled with soothing sounds of chimes. It's here we meet our 11th character, Windy, a playful and spirited breeze that carries the laughter of children on its wings.
Hello, traveler. Let me whisk you away on a gust of adventure and show you the wonders of the Enchanted Easterlands from above.
Embracing the thrill of flight, we soar through the sky with Windy, marveling at the breathtaking views of the magical realm. Flying up here on a glider is Diane from History Goes Bump, and it looks like she has a good story to share.
He was born as Edward Alexander Crowley on October 12, 1875, but most people know him as Aleister Crowley. Crowley was famously an occultist and magician who was known for his sex orgies, and many celebrities, writers, and artists claim to have been inspired by his writing and life. Some people may even be aware that he lived in a haunted house in the Scottish Highlands, but few are familiar with a point in his life when he faked his own death.
"Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," was a famous saying of Aleister Crowley, and the man lived accordingly. Crowley formed his own spiritual philosophy and religion around those words, known as Thelema. But long before that, Crowley was born to Christian parents who were very wealthy. He was sent to Christian boarding schools and then preparatory school. His father died of cancer when he was 11, and Crowley inherited a substantial amount of money. Acting out at school became the norm for him, and while he had considered his father his hero and friend, the relationship he had with his mother was strained. She eventually started calling him the Beast. Imagine that, calling your child the Beast.
That's terrible.
Around 1895, he started calling himself Alistair, which was the Gaelic form of Alexander. Around this same time, he started having sex with prostitutes, contracting both gonorrhea and syphilis, and he engaged in same-sex relationships as well.
In 1896, Crowley had his first mystical experience, and this would open up a whole new world for him. He was already studying philosophy, but now he focused more on the occult and black magic. Crowley joined the Order of the Golden Dawn in 1898, although that group wasn't crazy about his libertine way of life. Aleister began to travel the world and study more magical practices in places like Mexico, Japan, Hong Kong, and Paris. He also wrote prolifically, especially poetry. And he loved women in all these places, eventually marrying Rose Edith Kelly in 1903. Rose and Crowley would go to Cairo the next year, where they got involved in some pretty bizarre stuff. Over several days, Crowley claimed to hear the disembodied voice of an entity named Aiwass, who dictated the Book of the Law. This was the birth of Thelema, and the book stated that humanity was entering the Aeon of Horus, and Crowley was going to be its prophet. By 1909, Rose and Crowley were divorced, and he began forming relationships with other women, and he would refer to each new woman as his Scarlet Woman.
Crowley joined Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO, and he wrote liturgy for that group, and continued developing rituals for Thelema. He also continued working sex magic and other rituals, and many people started referring to him as, quote, the wickedest man in the world. Crowley reveled in the way people talked about him. By April of 1930, Crowley had moved to Berlin. He met a woman named Hannie Jaeger, and she became his new Scarlet Woman and magical partner. The couple had a troubled relationship. Hannie was a Californian 19-year-old, an artist, a model, and described as a spitfire. Crowley gave her the magical name Anu, but mainly called her Monster.
Lovely.
So he's the Beast and she's Monster.
Great.
And perhaps that is really what he thought of her, because he felt like he had to do something desperate to get away from her. A paper called the Empire News even reported that the couple had a very public fight in a hotel in which Hannie went into hysterics and threatened to kill herself.
Aleister Crowley had become good friends with the poet Fernando Pessoa, and this friendship was always described as strange. Pessoa was a prolific writer who was one of the greatest poets in the Portuguese language, but he was also quite shy. He translated works into Portuguese, and many of these were by leading theosophists like Helena Blavatsky. This connection to theosophy was probably what made the two men good friends. Pessoa even translated Crowley's Hymn to Pan into Portuguese. Crowley was tired of Hanny, or she had left him, and he figured if he died, then he could get away from her for good, or maybe even punish her in some way.
The specifics around their relationship aren't well known. Some say that she left him, others say that he left her. Clearly, this was a very turbulent relationship.
Crowley traveled to Boca do Inferno in Lisbon to fake his suicide. The location's name translates to Mouth of Hell, or Hell's Mouth, due to its rare scenic cliff formation, which made it a perfect spot for the Beast to supposedly off himself.
I'd say. Right into Hell's Mouth.
Pessoa and Crowley devised a plan for Crowley to write a suicide note and leave it at the top of this rocky outcrop under his signature cigarette case to lead people into believing he had jumped to his death. The text from his suicide note has been immortalized on a plaque that is attached to part of Hell's Mouth. It reads, "Can't live without you. The other mouth of hell that will catch me won't be as hot as yours." Oh my word.
It's a great way to say goodbye, world. Here I go.
Pessoa's job was to hand over the note to authorities and feed the papers information about the note. He claimed that the note had been decorated with occult symbols, and he also claimed that he had even been visited by the ghost of Crowley the day after he jumped off Hell's Mouth.
Now, you gotta love that the proof he's giving to the newspapers is, oh yeah, the other day, Crowley's ghost came to me, so that's how I know he's dead.
Cue the dramatic music.
Many of the local papers announced that Aleister Crowley was missing, while others said he was dead and at his own hand. It seems, as I was reading all these different papers, Kelly, nobody really was quite sure what was going on with him, but they knew one thing: he was definitely missing. To add more fuel to this mysterious fire, the Oxford Mail reported on October 15, 1930, that a London medium named A.V. Peters had stated that, quote, while in the trance, it was indicated that Mr. Crowley was dead and that he had been pushed over the cliff by an agent of the Roman Catholic Church. Catholics had made attempts on Mr. Crowley's life before, Mr. Peters stated, and he was expecting to be attacked. The place was described as being round like a crate of a volcano, and Mr. Peters added that it was in the mountains near water. A considerable part of the seance consisted of personal details as to Mr. Crowley's appearance, occupations, and health, for the purpose of verification, of course.
Of course.
So according to this medium, Crowley didn't kill himself, he was pushed.
Murder! Murder! People likened the death of Crowley to that of Greek philosopher Empedocles. Legend claims that Empedocles threw himself into the volcano Mount Etna. The talk around Crowley's death was all very dramatic, and we're sure that he enjoyed every minute of it. The plan was for Crowley to be dead for quite a long time, but the ruse only lasted 3 weeks, and it was all due to Crowley's ego. A large exhibit of his paintings was being held at an art gallery in Berlin in October of 1930. This would be one of only 2 showings that occurred in his lifetime. The temptation to hear all the adulation about himself at the showing was too much to resist, and Crowley showed up unannounced.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall there and hear what everybody had to say as he walked through the door. Were there gasps? Were there other people going, oh, we knew he was going to be doing something like this?
All the drama.
There are those who believe that Crowley didn't pull this stunt to annoy Hanny or get rid of her, but rather as some kind of publicity stunt. And that is very possible. Whatever the reason for faking his own death, it's not surprising that a controversial and flamboyant man like Crowley would do such a thing. Crowley did die for real on December 1st, 1947, at the age of 72. His legacy continues on today. His ashes are buried in, of all places, New Jersey.
Upon returning to the ground, we find ourselves in a cozy library, where thousands of books line the walls, each containing tales of imagination and wonder. Here we meet our 12th character, Paige, a wise, scholarly bookworm who guides us through the endless stories that await.
Welcome, traveler. The pages of these books hold the key to countless worlds and limitless possibilities. explore them and unlock the power of your own imagination.
As we peruse the shelves with Paige, we delve into fantastical stories and lose ourselves in the boundless realms of imagination, discovering that the greatest adventure lies within our minds. As we turn the corner, Andrea and Claudia are waiting to share a story from Judgy Crime Girls.
What would you do for $2 million?
Pretty much anything. Just ask. Anything at all.
Right, yes.
Who do you want me to kill?
Right. Well, a lot of people would do just about anything to strike it rich these days, right? But one Minnesota couple took it to the next level. It was a typical October morning in Moldova in 2011. A police officer on his morning jog spotted a dead body in the bushes, but there were no signs the person had been killed. The officer looked for bullet holes or signs of stabbing, but found nothing. Yet the corpse was already decomposing.
This is why I don't run.
I don't run either, unless there's food. I run towards food. The police officer called in the body, and it was transported to the morgue. There was a passport and a hotel key on the corpse that identified him as Igor Vorotinov. Authorities contacted Irina Vorotinov in Minnesota to ask her to come to Moldova and make sure the body was her ex-husband. She hopped on the first flight to Moldova, accompanied by a U.S. Embassy representative.
Official.
One look at the body and she confirmed that it was indeed her ex-husband, Igor. And after identifying the body, Irina and her sons started planning the funeral. But instead of having the body brought back to the United States, Irina opted to have him cremated in Ukraine, which I think is kind of a weird choice.
It is, but I mean the carry-on charges that they have these days.
That is true. It's easier to carry an urn, I guess. But what made it even weirder to me, anyway, is that she was not even his wife anymore. She was not the next of kin.
And you said his body was decomposed.
Yes.
So they're going off this name badge.
The passport and the hotel key. So just before they divorced in 2010, Igor had named Irina the beneficiary of his life insurance policy he took out with Mutual of Omaha, his $2 million life insurance policy.
Convenient.
Mm-hmm. I don't know why she was on there still, Andrea. Either they parted best of friends, or maybe she had some blackmail material on him. I don't know. Or they were getting ready to pull off one of the biggest, most elaborate frauds in the history of the crime. Don't know.
Could be. Dun, dun, dun.
Plot twist. A month after the funeral, Irina collected the insurance money. And most people in her shoes would have tried to at least maybe save it or invest it and not be flashy with it. However, Irina is not like most people, and she began moving the money to different bank accounts in Switzerland, Hungary, and Moldova.
Oh, honey, keep your money.
Well, nothing screams innocent like a Swiss bank account.
You know that's right.
So Alcon, the oldest son of Igor and Irina, traveled to Moldova for vacation. At a party thrown by a family friend, Alcon discovered his father was alive and well.
No.
Yes. Living under a new name, Nikoli Potoka.
You have got to be kidding me.
For 2 years.
And never called his son?
No.
That is so sad.
Yes. While someone was indeed cremated and buried in Lakewood Cemetery, it was not Igor. So who was cremated? Who'd they use?
I don't know. Who was it?
I don't know. The discovery in June of 2012 sent Alcon on an emotional roller coaster after finding out his dad is still alive. His attorney told the prosecutors that Alcon was innocent and this was all Irina and Igor's fault. He actually had to experience a funeral service for his father, only to find out later that his father was still alive. What kind of people put their own children through that kind of emotional turmoil?
No idea.
The whole scheme pretty much came undone, unraveled, because Alcon and his fiancée flew to Moldova too many times. Every few months they were going, and it caught the attention of federal investigators. So around Thanksgiving in 2013, Alcon and his fiancée were flying back to the U.S. when Customs and Border agents detained them in Detroit. They received a tip from an unidentified person that something fishy was going on with them, and they took their possessions and started looking through their stuff and trying to figure out what was going on. As they looked at Alcon's laptop, they found pictures of Igor that were taken in April and May of 2013, proving that he was alive.
I want to know who that nosy person was.
It was me. This is where Irina and Igor learned a very valuable lesson. Trying to cut their eldest son out of the money was definitely not a good idea because he flipped on them faster than a burger on the grill.
You know that's right.
In exchange, prosecutors lessened the charges he faced, but they needed just one more thing, and they needed to know for sure that Igor was alive. So Alcon called his father and put him on the phone with the feds. Igor created a whole scenario about being kidnapped and being held for ransom now. Of course, nobody believed him.
No.
I mean, who would?
No one.
Everyone believed the story was designed to make Irina look innocent. Well, it didn't work. She's currently in prison. Before her sentencing, she claimed to be a destitute felon and was angry that Igor seemed to have gotten away with everything because he was still in Moldova and nobody could find him at that time. Alcon was not happy either that his father had not been brought back to the States. Even as he faced prison time, him and Irina were ordered to pay back the $2 million.
Oh, good.
Yeah. I don't know how from prison, but they jointly have to pay the money back.
How are they going to pay that back?
I don't know. They're in prison. But at last, Igor was extradited to the U.S. and charged with mail fraud. He was sentenced to prison time along with his family in July of 2019. I guess the lesson here is don't fake your own death.
Be yourself.
It's just bad. It's not good. And no one will believe you when you really do die. Especially the life insurance company. They're not going to believe you.
Agents are jaded.
Yeah.
Insurance agents.
True.
You are not dead. Not today.
Prove it.
As we leave the library, we finally arrive at a magnificent meadow where the vibrant colors of countless butterflies paint the sky in a breathtaking display of beauty. It's here that we meet our 13th and final character, Papillonia, a graceful butterfly queen who embodies the essence of transformation and renewal.
Greetings, traveler. My subjects and I represent the cycles of change and growth that define the spirit of Easter. May you carry the power of transformation within you as you continue on your journey.
As we bid farewell to Papillonia and the Enchanted Easterlands, we reflect on the unique characters we've met and the wisdom they've imparted. Our hearts brimming with gratitude and wonder, we follow the rabbit back to our world, forever changed by our whimsical Easter adventure But before this adventure ends, I have one more story for you. This one from myself and Wendy at Foul Play Crime Series. It was a brisk spring day, Thursday the 21st of March 2002, in Seaton Carew, on the east coast of England. John Darwin wasn't due into work until later in the day, so decided to blow away the cobwebs by going out for a paddle on his canoe. He left the large house that he shared with his wife, shouted a quick hello to his neighbor, who was outside in his front garden, and crossed the road to the beach, where he entered the sea. Later that day, John failed to turn up for his shift as a prison officer at the local prison. Then, he failed to return home. So what happened to John Darwin?
John's wife Anne raised the alarm. She was a doctor's receptionist and had been at work when John left the house. There was no note, but she noticed that his canoe was missing when she arrived home. The huge search operation began. Anne was frantic with worry. She called the couple's 2 sons, who immediately made their way to their mum. It was a tense time. There was no sign of John. It was like he had just disappeared off the face of the earth. The Coast Guard rescue teams and police aircraft searched through the night. They found a double-ended paddle like the one that John owned, but there was no sign of the canoe or of John. In fact, it would be another few weeks until the shattered remains of John's red canoe were washed up on a local beach. But what had happened to John was a mystery. Or was it?
You see, on the outside, the couple were doing very well for themselves. They both had good, steady jobs. They had built up a large portfolio of rental properties. They had just moved into a new house. But on the inside, things were not looking so rosy. The reality was that the couple were riddled with mounting debt, with mortgages on multiple properties, along with the renovations that were needed on the new house that they had just purchased, plus the refurbishments on the bedsits in the house next door. Their luck had run out. They just couldn't afford the repayments any longer. And without a serious cash injection, everything would soon come crashing down around them. So, of course, they looked at their options and took the most logical next steps. They put the rental properties on the market to pay off some debt and free up some equity. Wrong. What they actually did was fake John's death so that Anne could claim on the life insurance to get them out of debt. What could go wrong?
So, John is missing. Anne is playing the distraught wife act very well. Their sons think their dad has been lost at sea. Police and Coast Guards are wasting huge amounts of money and resources searching for John. And where is John? Well, after spending a few days camping, which he decided was too difficult, and then holing up in a bed and breakfast a few miles up the road, John is living next door to Anne, in one of the couple's bedsits. And guess what? Conveniently, there is a secret door that leads from one house to the other. Yes, really. Don't worry, he's grown a beard so nobody will recognise him.
It's all going so well, exactly as they planned. So, all Anne has to do now is claim the life insurance money, pay off some debt, and then, well, then what exactly? John isn't going to be able to just come back home as if nothing has happened, is he? Not to worry, it's all part of the frankly ludicrous plan that they cobbled together.
So, back to the insurance claims. Without a body, it's really hard to claim that John is dead. Of course, John is furious. How dare the insurance companies make such crazy demands? He couldn't understand why they wouldn't just take Anne's word for it and pay out without a death certificate. John would make Anne call the companies, begging them to pay the claims, telling them she desperately needed the money, but the answer was still no. Then a year later, at an open verdict, John was officially declared dead, and Anne received £250,000, that's around $300,000, from the insurance companies, which allowed her to pay off the mortgage debt and get back on her feet. The end.
Hold on, not so fast. It's not the end. In fact, the story gets even crazier from here. Are you ready? So John has officially been declared dead. Tick. Anne has received the insurance money. Tick. The couple's, well, now Anne's debts, have been cleared. Tick. Now it's time for John to come back from the dead. Oh no, that's more tricky.
Time ticks on. John continues to live next door, sneaking through the connecting door during the day, sometimes joining Anne overnight, but always able to scurry back next door if there are visitors, or the police decide to stop by for a cup of tea. Eventually, the police lose interest, the case is closed, and Anne can take some time out to relax and reflect on what has happened. Of course, the couple's sons still think that their dad is dead. And when their mum announces that she has decided to go and live in Panama, they are confused and have some concerns. But she convinces them that she will be fine, and off she goes to hunt for property before she moves. So how is John going to come back from the dead? Well, firstly, he steals the identity of John Jones, a baby born around the same time as John Darwin, who died in infancy, just 34 days old. Then he applies for a passport before heading off with Anne on the 14th of July 2006 to start a new life in Panama.
John and Anne arrive in Panama, dizzy with excitement. They got away with it. They can now be together again properly and start a new business. And this is where they make a fatal mistake. While meeting with real estate agents, they happily pose for a photograph for the agent's portfolio. A photo that will later be spread across the front page of every newspaper in the United Kingdom. A photo that would prove that John was not dead, after all. A photo that would prove that John had faked his own death. But for the moment, they are still living in their bubble of happiness.
Just 10 months after that first visit to Panama, John and Anne purchase a property. They want to run it as an activity centre for holidaymakers. Anne sells the house in Seaton, Carew, and moves to Panama to join John. They did it. Everything they planned has come to fruition. Yes, they left their sons without a dad, but hey, they have an amazing new life. Maybe one day they can explain to their sons what happened and they will forgive them. Or maybe not.
And then, just when everything was going so well, Panama threw a wrench in the works. They changed the laws for anyone wanting to obtain a visa. So, now in order for John to live and work in Panama, he had to have his identity confirmed by the British police. Oh, now this was a problem, because John Darwin was legally dead. And John Jones, well, he died when he was just 34 days old. It was time for a new plan. John had a brainwave. All he had to do was go back to England, walk into a police station claiming he had amnesia, and then be declared legally alive. Simple.
Well, actually, no, that's not quite how it works. I mean, John tried. He returned to England, walked into West End Central Police Station in London, and said he didn't know who he was and could they help. Of course the police helped. They managed to identify who he was and called his sons to tell them their dad was in fact alive and well. Well, what John didn't know was that just a few months before, the police had reopened their inquiry into his death as it seemed suspicious. And it was not long after he returned to the United Kingdom that the picture of him standing with Anne and the real estate agent in Panama was released by the press. Game over.
John and Anne were arrested, and on the 23rd of July, 2008, they were both convicted of fraud. John was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months. Anne was sentenced to 6 years and 6 months. And they had to repay nearly £600,000, or $720,000, to the insurance companies that they defrauded. Hello again, dear friend. Our journey has now come to an end. If you've enjoyed this collaboration, I hope you will try out one of the others we've arranged. My Bloody Valentine for Valentine's Day, and A Nightmare Before Halloween for Halloween. Up next are the holiday collaborations for Mother's Day and Father's Day. So if you know of a good podcaster you'd like to see join us for the collaborations, please reach out. We are all a group of podcasters wanting to create something unique for your listening pleasure, so your feedback is welcome. Remember, all the podcasts you heard from are in the episode show notes, along with a link to where to find them. I've been your Easterlands guide, Shane Waters. Until our next adventure, stay vigilant and don't let anyone's death fool you.